And welcome to MC and Mad Talk of Civil War. This is episode 27. It's been about a month since we last did one. My power went out. We had that winter storm go through and messed my schedule all up. But we're back at it, and it's 1864 now. We're headed in towards the final push here by the North, and what really drives the death hammer home, right?
Well, right now we're starting we're beginning the sequence for the end game, okay? And there's several things that are dynamics that are a part of this. Right now, it's the beginning of these campaigns. The North hasn't followed up on its victories at all from Chattanooga to a large extent. What they're doing in Chattanooga now is they're getting ready for the push. Grant leaves Sherman in charge of basically that entire army down there and then moves north. It is handed the command of course, all the Union forces. He comes north. He goes out and he begins a campaign, all right, that it looks on paper very similar, all right, to the Peninsula campaign. And it's going to rehash across many of the same areas that the Army of the Potomac has been through several different times. It's also going to have some interesting dynamics as it goes through, because the one thing that everybody understands is it's 1964. This is an election year, all right, for the United States of the United States. All right. Why is this important? Because the elections are still going to happen. There were many people in the cabinet that were advising Lincoln to say, look, we're in a Civil War time frame. You should suspend the elections. And he said no. He said, we are going to go ahead.
Politically, that would have been suicide, right? Especially when gosh darn it. What was his name running against him? It was his general, right? It was McClellan.
Well, McClellan gets chosen. We haven't gotten to that part yet. That point. I don't think it would have been suicide to have called off the elections while the war was going on necessarily, from a political standpoint.
I think it would have actually after Lincoln's death. The Supreme Court overruled his suspension of posse comitatus. They overruled a lot of stuff. And if he would have,
they're doing things. They were making comments about certain things. They didn't overrule a lot like you said he did. Right? It comes down to, let me give an example or something. This is the same kind of garbage that goes on about revisionist history. Right? It had been upheld by the Supreme Court all through the war. Okay. A few years later, then they overrule it. Same thing with the internment camp of the Japanese. All right,
that's a fair point. Yeah,
the society changes around that, and then you get this revisionist garbage that goes on because of the time frame. Now, so when we talk about this, okay, and we say when he chose to say no, we are still going to have a an election. Okay. Many people thought it was foolish. All right. Other people looked at it and said, okay, this guy is a brave son of a bitch. All right. Because with all this going on, you're still going to hold an election, and he said, look, these are the principles of our country. We're going to stand by them. And a lot of people respected that. So, they respected that decision. The outcome of everything was far from certain. All right. And we're going to see that as it starts to play out, because there's several events that do happen as a result.
Do you think, before we start really getting into first the Wilderness Campaign and then Spotsylvania Courthouse, do you think that if Lee had the forces, right now Lee is sitting with about 65,000 men under his command. Grant's going to invade with 115,000. Mm-hmm. That puts Lee in a position where, yes, he could choose the ground to defend, which he does, and he chooses wisely. But he can no longer go on the offensive. And if it was an election year, if he was able to go north, he could have affected the election. That was originally the reason they were in Pennsylvania to begin with when Gettysburg happened.
If he would have went north, what would he accomplish? He would have lost.
He had too small of a force to accomplish anything, which is why he didn't do it.
Well,
again.
It's not just that. He doesn't have. There's several things that have happened. You got to remember, Chattanooga's fallen. Right. The supply situation for the South is dire now. All right. Logistically, all right, to do a kind of build up logistically to be able to do an invasion into the North. Right. He doesn't have the ability. He really doesn't have the ability, all right, to do that. He doesn't have the supplies, the logistics to be able to do this anymore. The South can't give him enough, you know, ammo and enough artillery and enough of what he needs to do any kind of an invasion like this. So that's hugely several things that South, because of the loss of what's been happening to their dwindling people, the South is also having a problem now with desertion. All right, and one more thing that's very important: Grant ends repatriation. Okay.
Yeah, the prisoner exchange is what you're talking about, right?
That's exactly right. And the reason that he did it was perfectly understandable. All right, when we get our soldiers back from repatriation, they go home. When the South gets their people back, they just go back and they go back into the military again. Violate their terms and go right back into the military. All right, they don't go home.
Well, it's because they were forced to. They were at this point in '64 and then especially in '65. They were taking the home guard and throwing them into the front line, and that's old men and children.
Yes, well, they're not quite there yet, but they're getting ready to be. They're not quite there, but they're getting ready to be. All right. There's also going to be something that happens in this campaign, and I didn't bring it up on it, but I will when we go into it. All right, that happens as well, but because I'm going to surprise you with it.
All right, well, go ahead and so yeah, Grant. Let me see what the date is here. I have all right, so it was the spring of '64, May 4th, when Grant crosses the river, right? Yeah, the Rappahannock.
Yep. And let me go ahead and pull up this first part of this map before we get to this. All right, let me go over here. That's not what I wanted. Doggone it. Hold on just a second. No, that's not the one I wanted.
But and he crosses with as I said before, 115,000 men. Lee has 65,000. But Lee sets up his defenses in.
You got to remember something though about Grant. All right, Grant has certain liabilities as well. All right, because he has to maintain his lines of communication. Okay, so yes, he has these major forces and they outnumber them. The problem is he has to leave them in places. All right, he has to use them in places that Lee doesn't have to. All right, so this is basically the overland campaign or the wilderness campaign, and this is where you start to see what's happening. The first part you end up with is this section right here, and then we're going to move down to Spotsylvania, and then we're going to come down here to Cold Harbor. All right, and we're going to talk about these different little conflicts. Okay,
and Cold Harbor. I actually didn't realize how close Cold Harbor is to Richmond.
Well, that's the whole point. It's back down to the Richmond campaign, on to Richmond, only this time it's literally an on to Richmond. It's a Richmond or a bust. Okay. So, I mean,
well, Richmond is a hard road to travel.
Okay, let's get into the actual battle here. The first conflict is this one right here. All right, let me bring this up. Share. Windows. Boom, boom. All right. So here's how the first battle, and it happens in May 5th. All right. Now, this battle, all right, first of all, what Grant was trying to do, and I showed you that on the previous one, is he's trying to move around to get ahead of Lee's military, all right, to get to Richmond and get between him and Richmond. This is the first thought. Okay. Lee, of course, all right, knows this and is watching this movement, and he's able to move his army down, and he's able to seal, all right, this orange turnpike, and down below this there's another turnpike, and I'll get to that map in a minute, another part of this battle, all right, where he starts setting up his forces. Now Lee at this point is thinking, okay, it's a race. Okay, it's a race to see who can get the other ones, because if he could have gotten to this turnpike first, okay, and set up, then he could have been deployed lengthwise on the turnpike instead of what he is parallel in perpendicular to it. He could have been parallel to it and gotten possibly gotten some of Meade's corps, or Meade's army, Grant and Meade, and gotten some of the corps and hit them as they came up. All right, that fails. But at the same time, the Army of the Potomac doesn't get there first either. Now they're moving through heavily wooded areas. Once again, the weather hasn't been wonderful, so movement is slow all along here. All right, you're inundated with the spring rains. All right, and what you see here, even though it looks all nice and neat, like it's all lined up nicely here, it looks like, oh, look, there's this could go either way. It wasn't like this. They were meeting each other at different times across this whole freaking wooded zone. Okay, back and forth. Okay, so it becomes like a rolling battle. It turns into more of a meeting engagement, because at some points the pickets encounter one another, right? And you're at the point where you're not shooting them at 100 yards or so. You're basically 5 yards away when you see one another. Okay, you're literally within rock throwing distance. Okay, when you can see these people. So this battle starts to flow back and forth, and you can see how everyone starts to deploy. Now, this is the first part of the deployment, all right? And you can see how this battle starting to take place. You see Ewell here, you see Johnston here, you see Gordon, which is part of Ewell's campaign, come up along this line and try and push. At the same time, you have Slocum as part of Warren's group, all right, coming down, and it's turned into just a slugfest in the woods. And fighting in the woods is chaotic in more than ways than one, because your commanders can't see very well as to what's going on.
Well, no, and Gordon, from what I was reading right before we went on air, he busts through, I believe, Stone and Cutler, their divisions. He actually breaks through. They have to funnel in Morris and Donaldson up to fill the gap, I believe, if I'm reading that correctly.
Yes, and that does happen. But you'll notice where Wadsworth was, right? Wadsworth looks like he could have made a flanking maneuver, right? Problem is, nobody knows what the hell's going on, and here's the other reason. All right, let me pull this other map up. I thought I had the other map. Where is it at?
And yeah, you're not messing around either. This is through woods. Lee has set up defenses. He knows. He doesn't know Grant and his fighting style quite yet. This is a first engagement between the two, I believe. But he does. He will understand Grant soon. Very shortly.
The advantage that Lee has is Grant is well known by Longstreet. They knew each other. They were partners during the Mexico campaign. They knew each other from West Point. All right.
Yeah.
we're still, they were very good friends, and they're still good friends. And this is the other thing that made, about the Civil War, is you once again have people that know each other and are very friendly with each other on a personal level, right? Fighting against one another, in a death struggle, to many extents, right? It's sad in a lot of ways, all right.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially, you bring your core up and damn well, like, somebody you might have considered your best friend is directly across the field from you. You will be
well, and they're gonna fight. Okay, they're not gonna back down. They're gonna fight. They're going to try and kill one another. This is not a joke. They're literally trying to kill one another. They know that the other person is on the other side. All right. And they're still trying to carry this out. All right. They know it. They're saddened by it, but they're still going to do it. There's nothing that's going to stop them from doing it. I mean, it's really sad as to what's going on. Okay. Here's the other map. Let me get this other map up. What I want to show everybody so that they understand what's happening here.
Yeah, no, and Voice of One's in the chat. This is just what the History Channel always needed. Screaming kids in the background. Thank you, Voice. I'm glad you appreciate it.
Okay. Now, if you look at this map, what you're seeing, all right, remember, this is where you were talking about what was going on up here at the Orange Turnpike. Well, down here at this turnpike, you got Hancock's Corps. Okay. And they were trying to come up, and you end up with another meeting battle right down here. All right. And you can see where this is the beginning deployment, and this is the final deployment. All right, for the South, this is the beginning deployment, and this is the final deployment of the Union. All right, it looks, if you look at this right now, everyone would look at it and go, look, the two military, two groups are separated by a group here. Longstreet's Corps is down here. Ewell's Corps is here. This whole area here looks like, wow, it looks like it's open. You could just kind of like push through and break through, right? Wait
a minute, though. This map has proposed Walmart Supercenter site. I didn't know Walmart was around back then.
Okay, this is it wasn't. What's happened here is this is one of the historical groups, right? The American Battlefield Trust. And they're trying to save this. They're trying to prevent this from happening because part of the battlefield is being taken up by
okay, fair enough. And I applaud them for trying to, protect our historical battlefields. But that's just funny. I'm like, wait a minute, Walmart? What the fuck's going on?
It is kind of an amusing kind of thing, but it shows you what's happened here. It shows you just how difficult, because right here, oh, well, you can just drive right through here. No, you can't just drive through here. All right. This is all heavily wooded. Nobody knows what's going on through here. As you can see, it's crisscrossed with all sorts of rivers and so forth. All right. What you basically had was people are trying to move along these roads, and this is what you're doing. Okay. So the battle, while both sides end up about equal as far as casualties, more or less. I think the South takes a few less casualties because the Union was generally in the attack. All right, but it's not really it's really more of a draw at this point. However, all right, Grant is stymied. Okay, and the positions after the next day become untenable. All right, for I shouldn't say untenable, but they're not in the condition that that's going to be helpful to the Union.
Well, no, and the thing is, though, after day one, the Confederates also almost broke. Okay, so Longstreet shows up pretty much in the nick of time. And then, is it that night of day one, or is it day two when he gets shot, kind of like Stonewall did, and it was friendly fire?
It's basically late on day one. All right, I mean, they basically just shoot at each other, basically, and then they stop and so forth, and they're trying to reconnoiter. All right, now that's a wounding of Longstreet again. All right, I mean, Longstreet,
he's out for 5 months, and in those 5 months, you have Spotsylvania and Cold Harbor in succession.
You also have something else, and we're going to get to that. something that's very devastating.
Okay, well, yeah, then go ahead. I just wanted to bring up Longstreet being injured because he does survive. He does not die like Stonewall did, but him being out of commission for 5 months, I mean, who does Lee have left that he has faith in at this point in the war? I mean, Stonewall's dead. Longstreet's on his deathbed. I mean, especially right after Stonewall dying in 63. Now you have Longstreet injured with the same injury, right?
Well, not the
gets
same injury, but I mean, as far as I know, Longstreet doesn't lose an arm. Or did he?
Yeah, I think you're right. I don't think they amputated it. That's correct. So.
I know he was. He is severely. I mean, because if I remember correctly, in this, he wasn't just shot in the arm. He also received an injury. What was it? Was it in the abdomen? All right.
If you look at Grant has Hancock. Grant has Meade running that army. He has faith in Meade, or he would have had him replaced. So he has faith in him. And
that's an interesting thing, because when Grant arrives, all right, Meade immediately sees him and says, "Okay, you're going to be the new general. You know, I will step aside. You can bring in your own staff and so forth. Right? I'm not gonna. You know, I understand the situation." And Grant looks at him and says, "No, I'm leaving you in charge of the Army of the Potomac. I am the overall commander of all forces. I am not relieving you of command." This is important. This is more important than people realize, because what he didn't do was scramble the command. All right, he left the command in place as it was. All right, and as Meade wanted it, without scrambling it, so the continuity could continue. Sometimes, even if you don't have the best commanders, scrambling commanders into unknowns, all right, can cause a lot more damage than just letting average commanders be in the positions that they're in. And
yes and no, because when you look at Bragg and you look at the mess that
average commanders. I'm not saying that there aren't reasons that you can dismiss things, but you've got to remember, up to this point, every time a battle's fought, they have removed a commander.
That's a very good point.
Whenever there's a big battle that was been fought with the Army of the Potomac, whether it was a victory or not, the commander is replaced. Now think on that. That goes all the way through 81, 82, and into 83.
Yeah, no, you're right. You can't have any continuity in your command structure. And what does that do to your for lack of a better term, the brigade level people, even? Because if they see the top level people being replaced every battle, then they don't know. They can't trust their own command system, is what I'm trying to say.
Right. Now all of a sudden, what happens is they're able to solidify. Okay. So what does Grant do? All right. Grant says, okay, he assesses the situation. If I can't go through here, we'll continue to try and move south. The moment he starts putting people in the line to move south, his troops start cheering. They actually are absolutely ecstatic. Now, they just ran into a hard battle, hard walking through, fighting through wilderness, fighting through freaking trees in a meeting battle that was absolutely got nothing done. And now they're cheering. Why? Because unlike what's happened before, Grant is not retreating. He's continuing the fight, moving south. And his troops now are basically now they are his troops. They're not Meade's troops anymore. Meade is under Grant, yes, but they are now Grant's troops, because they're now, this guy is serious. We're going to win this battle. And this leads now to the next battle, which is in Spotsylvania.
When Lee doesn't see them turn tail and run, this is the first time, at least for Lee, where they haven't. After he wins a battle, the Union doesn't run.
Yep.
He has to be, quite frankly, worried and maybe even terrified.
Well, he's like, now that he knows from a military perspective, He's done. Okay. Now it's a matter of hoping I can hang on. All right. At this point in time, you got to remember the strategy that they had wedded themselves to with the Gettysburg campaign. The strategy that they had wedded to with the Gettysburg campaign was to take it to the election and get a new president that was willing to talk on peace terms, right? To get a political solution out of this, to force a political solution out of the North. Okay. At this point in time now, Lee understands, okay, he's not somebody who's just going to let me do what I want. I am no longer going to be able to be on the offensive. I've got to play to his tune. I'm now being forced to react to what Grant is doing rather than everyone reacting to what Lee is doing.
Well, he knew it was going to be a different type of battle from here on out, but I don't necessarily, when I say terrified, that's from a military perspective of we are an outnumbered force, and now we're on the defensive. We can no longer maneuver. I mean, they still maneuver. They forced the battle at Cold Harbor. We'll get to that. The Confederates forced that battle to happen, basically, and they win. But it's now just a pivot motion by Grant, and he's just going to keep moving, and he has freedom of movement. And as he's moving, he's able to tear apart everything in his path.
Well, he's not tearing apart everything in his path, though, but he's preventing Lee, all right, from being able to do anything. All right, so let's get to Spotsylvania. Let's see if I can pull up this one correctly.
Do you think Davis, when he noticed that the Union isn't going to run anymore, does it ever enter Davis's mind to maybe move the capital at least temporarily?
There was already discussions of this.
Well, if they put it back in Montgomery, I really think it would have been better, and they would have had freedom of movement again.
Yeah, but how are you going to bring it back to Montgomery? Are you kidding me? How are you going to get down there?
He makes it pretty far in that dash that we'll talk about at the end of the war. But hey, yeah.
Right, but you're talking about moving the entire government in wholesale all the way down there and abandoning Richmond, which means you're basically abandoning Virginia.
Yeah, but you have no room to maneuver anymore. It's either move the capital or lose the war. Wouldn't you rather move the capital?
Well, I mean, what were you going to gain from that? Honestly, what were you going to gain?
Freedom of movement, and if you bring that back your lines and have to defend a smaller territory.
Well, yeah, but you're abandoning Virginia, all right? You're abandoning all of your basically heavy metal capabilities. All right. Got to remember, you know, this is where the South's industrial power is now. Right.
Is Sherman pushing towards Atlanta yet?
Sherman is marching on Atlanta simultaneously while this is taking place.
That's what I thought. So you can't necessarily fall back on your manufacturing base in Georgia.
Right, because that's under pressure now as well. How are you going to get to Mobile? How are you going to get down to Montgomery? How are you going to get down into there? All right. And of course, what army is there? All right, let's say you run there yourself. What army is going to be there, all right, to defend you if Sherman goes, oh, you move the capital here, let me put some forces here just as a holding force and take out Montgomery. There was really no major force that could have stopped him.
Well, you take the army of Northern Virginia with you. I mean, obviously.
Once again, you're going to load them up on trains? You think, I mean, and try and do all of this? I mean, think of the logistics that it would take.
They still had rail lines.
Okay, where are your rail lines going to go? I want you to consider this. Where are your rail lines going?
I don't have a map in front of me of the rail lines back then, so
what has happened is Chattanooga has fallen. Okay, so in order to go by rail, you basically got to go through the Carolinas.
You would at least have food.
Okay, so what you basically did would you would have seeded, all right, Virginia and everything all the way down to where? To Chattanooga, right? To the Union, because you're basically taking all the military forces out of that area, right? Right? And in order to try and go to Montgomery. All right. So now you have the Army of the Potomac and the Army of the Cumberland under Sherman, all right, united together against what? The Army of Northern Virginia. How well is that going to work?
That's a good point, and you could move on to the next battle. I need to call my wife real quick, so if you can pull that up and talk, okay, I can still hear you. I'll jump right back in. She has texted me, so I need to call her real quick.
Let me pull this up here real quick. This is the next battle. You see him; he's moving, and he's pivoting to Spotsylvania. All right, and this is the Spotsylvania courthouse, where the next part of the battle is taking place. You see, in this situation, now what's interesting here is you can see how Grant was trying to get to Spotsylvania ahead of everybody because of the roads. He thought he could get here to the road systems. Lee gets there faster due to the rails and the fact that he has interior lines. And he's able to move much, much quicker. And Grant is when he finds this out, they do launch an attack, but the attack is repulsed very heavily. All right. The losses by Grant are heavy. Once again, Lee, though, loses troops in here. You can see how the battle basically develops. This is another situation where all along here, Lee has taken the high ground, and Grant is attempting. All right, the initial part of this, Grant is attempting to basically push through this position. Okay. It's unsuccessful. This counterattack by Rhodes, all right, basically forces the Union forces that initially run the attack back on the defensive, and it forces Sedgwick to pull in all of his forces and deploy them before this gets turned into a rout. Okay, now you see that these things get constructed. You have May 8th. You have this going on. All right. And basically this becomes another stalemate. All right. You end up looking at one another. All right. What does Grant do? Grant says, okay, I'm going to attempt the pivot south again. Now, at this point, by the way this looks, there's many people who will think that you could swing around this way with your army. Lee could come back and then try and hit Grant around this flank. The problem is that if he attempts to do that, Grant can actually go this way because it's this way towards Richmond. All right.
Lee has to defend Richmond at all costs.
Right, he can't. He's limited because he can't let Richmond fall. He's always got to place himself between Richmond and Grant, because if he opens a hole there, Grant will take Richmond.
What's interesting, though, looking at the map, is it looks like the Union should have been able to bust through the center of the Confederate line. I'm surprised they didn't.
This is a high point with artillery, and they just get slaughtered. Right here, there's a major loss of life that takes place here. There's a reason they call artillery, they call infantry the queen of battle. All right? They call artillery the king of battle. There's a reason. Okay.
No, and the Confederacy, you can tell that they fill up the center just with their big guns, right?
Yep. So charging massed artillery is a losing proposition. You could ask Pickett.
Ouch.
Okay. So what does Grant do here? Well, two things happen. And we didn't pull this up because it's not really much. It's really more of a skirmish. Okay. Something major happens right after this battle. And that is Yellow Tavern. Okay. What happens at Yellow Tavern is Lee loses Jeb Stuart.
Go ahead and explain to everybody how that actually plays out, because that is a very big blow.
Jeb Stuart, of course, is the eyes that Lee relies upon. Now, Lee, for whatever reason, never develops a really good rapport with anybody else aside from when it comes to the cavalry. There's only 2 cavalry officers he's ever trusted. Right, one is Jeb Stuart, and another one was a deputy that he has now sent off. All right, named Mosby. Okay, and Mosby has been sent to go into the Shenandoah. All right, to secure the Shenandoah and basically create havoc in the background with his irregulars. Okay. For whatever reason, the Lee never takes to and never develops the kind of rapport that he has with Stuart with any of his subordinates. Now, part of this, to be honest, is Stuart's own fault. All right, Stuart is and while he's a flamboyant man, he's also a narcissistic dickhead. All right, who does some things that create havoc within his own command. And it's one of the reasons why that Gettysburg, there's many people that blame Gettysburg strictly on Stuart. All right.
There's part of me that is among that crowd. I go back and forth depending on what day you ask me, because he was Lee's eyes. And yeah, you needed shoes and supplies. I get it. But man, did you fuck that one up.
Well, it started even before you get to Gettysburg. It started earlier because he had shaken up his command because of some personal issues, all right, involving women, all right, that have created him to send some of his commanders that Lee actually knew and maybe could trust, all right, and gives them and forces them basically to stay behind into a holding action where they don't actually participate in the Gettysburg campaign as a result. And one of the problems, of course, is that the cavalry forces that Stuart does leave with Lee are commanded by people that, one, Lee doesn't know, and worse, Lee doesn't trust. Okay, and this leads to a lot of the lack of understanding of the terrain and the ground, because Lee can't trust their word. He can't trust them to do what he needs them to do. And there's a lot of people blame Lee, saying, well, he should have trusted these guys. Actually, no, he shouldn't have. These guys were the guys that were left were inferior cavalry commanders. They really were. All right. So there's a lot of people.
How did Stuart end up getting himself dead, though?
Okay. So it's after this battle, all right. He is holding. He is in an encampment, basically in the area of Yellow Tavern. All right. He is at a basically he's trying to do a parade. All right. He's trying to redress his lines and basically create a show. These shows and these press and review things are very important. All right. I mean, it's part of the military, military display, but it's also a display of your military, discipline and so forth. Right. And pride and things like that. He's there to do that. And he is surprised when a surprise attack by Philip Sheridan. All right. And you end up with a cavalry on cavalry attack. Basically, it's a small little engagement with cavalry shooting at each other on foot. Nobody, there isn't any land to attempt to be gained. All right. They drive off Sheridan's forces. But then again, Sheridan's forces were just there spoiling for a fight. They were just wanted to attack and hit the enemy cavalry. They weren't. It was a raid. It wasn't it wasn't anything more than just a raid and a spoiling attack. And during that spoiling attack, okay, Stuart is killed. Now Lee has lost his leader for cavalry.
Yeah, well, no, and you have Longstreet injured and out of the fight for 5 months. You no longer have your trusted cavalry officer, who was, maybe he was narcissistic, whatever. Maybe he was full of himself and brash and arrogant, but he was also damn good.
He was accurate. He gave accurate All right, concise information. If Stewart gave Lee information, it was accurate. All right, now some people say that, okay, well, wait a minute, Harry, I'm seeing, I mean, anybody could have gotten that information. It isn't just like that. All right, you got to remember what people look at as information today. It means estimates of troops, where the troop movement is, the concentration of troops, who those troops are. Okay, when you see troops and you're watching how they're going and you're watching how you're marching, all right, it is kind of a witchcraft kind of game, saying, how am I able to discern what I'm actually looking at, how much power there is, how much force structure is there. Okay, so you have to know certain things. You got to know if your commanders have the commanders under you that are giving you things, if they have a tendency to exaggerate like 15 or 20%, you just knock off 15 or 20%. If another one has an accuracy, but they tend to leave off 15 or 20%, then you know that those commanders leave off 15 or 20%. Okay, you develop this over time. You can also, the other thing that Stewart was very good at is he could train his officers to accurately assess things. All right, and he would put them in charge, and generally he was able to do that. But as the war progresses, one of the things that we don't ever really talk about is the damage that was done to the cavalry, all right, from their commanders, all right, is significant in that Stewart is constantly losing trusted commanders, all right, and you're not being given the time, all right, to retrain and redress these guys the way it needs to be. So the ability to your information now becomes a lot more difficult. The advantage the South, of course, had is Stewart understood. Most of the people around me, all right, are telling me the truth. Most of the people around me are on my side. Okay, so they're gonna tell me, and he would also utilize his forces to glean information from the surrounding the surrounding people, the population, all right, as to what was going on. All right, all of this was part that Lee never had to worry about. Lee never had to think about that kind of stuff. All right, the other person who tended to do that, to be honest, is now been injured. All right, because the other person who did that, of course, was Longstreet.
Yeah, and Lee didn't have contact with Forrest over in the West, but Forrest was a pretty good cavalry officer himself. You could have maybe brought him over from the West, but you needed somebody.
The problem with having Forrest brought in, quite frankly, is Forrest was a hothead. And what I don't mean that in the negative sense. Forrest wanted battle. Okay, Forrest wanted to engage in battle. He would not shy away from battle, and that became problematic because, unlike Stewart, who would understand the situation and say, "Okay, I'm here to gather information. I'm not here to have battle," and would pull out of certain areas. Right. Forrest would immediately charge in. He would just go in there and try and wreck as much shit out and then run back out. Okay, I mean, from movement and wrecking and doing things like that, Forrest was phenomenal. Gathering intel, he could do it, but was he effective at that? No, because he always wanted to do battle necessarily, and he had a problem being told what to do. All right, it wouldn't have been long before Robert E. Lee would have dressed him down, and Forrest, being the kind of pig-headed dickhead that he was, all right, would take that as a slight against him, because Lee came from the gentry aristocracy and had all those mannerisms and everything, and that's something Forrest absolutely hated.
Yeah, I don't think their personalities would have meshed together at all, to be honest. I think you have a very good point there.
Yeah, I think there would have been a problem there. It didn't need to be a problem, okay? And I don't think that it would have been a problem so much on Lee's end, all right? But the military mindset end was not something, quite frankly, that Forrest ever took to, all right? He would have
was
been
more of a Mosby type guy or a Bloody Bill Anderson. Even though he was in the regular army, he was a cavalry officer. He was commissioned.
To an extent, all right? I mean, to an extent. He did believe in discipline. He did believe in moving as a unit. He did believe in the Southern cause and supporting things. All right. he had his own personality quirks. It's a question as to whether or not he could have swallowed these personality quirks, all right, or not. Now, we will never know this because let's be quite frank. Who was he working with generally? Generally, he was working with Bragg. Well, nobody got along with Bragg, right? So maybe that personality characteristics was exacerbated because he was constantly dealing with Bragg. There's no way to know.
Yeah. So after Spotsylvania, and Yellow Tavern happens, we'll go ahead and go into Cold Harbor, and then I think next week, we talk about Atlanta, right?
I think we got to talk about Atlanta, and then after that, we'll talk about Shenandoah.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Sheridan, right now finally gets the upper hand in the Shenandoah Valley.
Well, we need to describe some things because Lee attempts to do something. It's actually kind of important. We'll get to it right after we talk about this. All right. Let me pull this up.
Now, Cold Harbor, out of all three of the battles, I believe Cold Harbor was the most decisive Confederate victory. It was also the bloodiest of the three, wasn't it?
Yeah, because, well, yes. and you'll see why. Once again, Grant has pivoted to try and move south. All right. Lee has gotten there once again ahead of him. All right. And they take the high ground. All right. They are in position, in depth in the high ground. The battle begins. All right. Just like this, you can see this looks like a tremendous amount of force here, and it is, but the positions are dug in, they're well enforced. All right, Grant, the first attacks along these lines right here get repulsed with serious losses, and Grant orders the charge again. Right back into the steel of these batteries in this heavily fortified position. And the result is a loss of another 5,000 men. All right.
On that map, Pickett is just up in the air. Is he guarding the flank?
Yes.
Or
Pickett,
okay, so he's in reserve guarding the flank.
Now, what's interesting at this point in time is Lee is not happy with Pickett. Pickett has not responded well. Okay. So from Pickett's charge on, Pickett is not, he's not the commander that he was. It's all the fight has really gone out of Pickett.
Do you think he got shell shock? For lack of a better term, I guess we could use the term they use nowadays, PTSD. But
I think that he's suffering from a type of buyer's remorse. And I don't mean that in that he's upset that he's fighting for the cause. All right, I mean that he's brooding. He constantly broods over the loss of Lee of losing his division, and he blames Lee for it. Okay, he will not trust Lee anymore. He is slow to move. All right, he's slow to follow orders. There is absolutely no initiative in him whatsoever.
At that point, then he should have been removed from command or sent west, right?
Well, that sounds all well and good, except for one thing. You're strapped for people. You're strapped. All right. You need every available man because you're constantly being pressed. Lee actually does eventually order him to be removed, which we'll talk about, later on. But it's the reason they don't get rid of him is simply because they don't. I mean, who are you going to bring him? Who are you going to bring along? Who are you going to replace him with? I mean, what are you going to do? He is still a West Pointer. He still does know how to at least move troops and how to tell troops how to move with the commands and everything. And at this point in time, you're at your wit's end trying to stop everything that's going on.
Can you promote within your own structure already? Maybe somebody that wasn't a West Pointer had proved themselves.
You can, but at this point in time, are you going to scramble another command? I mean, at this point, you're like, well, you're fighting with the army you have, not with the army you want. Right? I mean, fair. And that's basically what happened. So this is where Cold Harbor takes place. All right, you see the pivoting take place here. Now comes something Lee doesn't expect. Okay, this pivot right here surprises Lee. Lee is expecting, all right, Grant to actually pivot this way to try and come back over on this territory, and Grant is able actually to cross this area. Right, I think this is the James River. He's able to cross the James River before Lee is even prepared for it. The problem is Grant's commanders let him down. Instead of immediately taking the initiative, all right, Lee realizes what it is able to use this railroad line to get his forces down there to save Petersburg. Petersburg is critical to keep this line open, okay, because it's one of the last rail lines into Richmond.
And this, the siege begins in 64 and doesn't end until the Confederates withdraw from Richmond. This is Lee's end point, right?
There's nothing. Lee is stuck here. Now, Lee does something here, all right, and what he does do is he says, okay, these defensive positions are really well and good, but I need to find a way to try and do some other things. He actually detaches early, all right, to go through the Shenandoah and attempt to try and stage around Washington.
Right. He needs to release the pressure from Richmond. He needs Grant to pull back, back towards DC.
And so he sends him up there. The problem is, of course, is Early doesn't have the forces, all right, to even really do much. Now he does get within sight of Washington and the Washington defenses, and one of the things that's quite interesting is Abraham Lincoln comes out, all right, to inspect the troops, to see Early's troops. And he's looking at him. He's basically able to see the troops, and he's within sniper distance. And it's obvious who he is because he walks around with that stovepipe hat on. I mean, everybody is fully aware who he is, right? And nobody ever takes a shot at him. In fact, the generals, of course, that are there are very upset that the president is doing this because they're like, thinking, you're going to get shot. You're going to be killed. And he's like, well, I'm the president. These are my troops. I'm going to see what's going on with it. And Early never, rightly so, never attempts to actually do this.
Rightly so. Okay. Why is that correct?
Because the amount of massed artillery and the positions of the artillery would have got his troops absolutely slaughtered.
Okay, that's why. All right, because I was thinking strategically, dude. You have Richmond surrounded. You know you don't have the forces. You can't take DC. There's not a chance. You are in the death throes of the Confederacy right now. Atlanta is burning. There is a couple battles in the West that do happen after this. We will talk about them, but we're pretty much at the end.
Well, at this point, Don, it starts the siege of Petersburg, and we'll go into the Battle of Petersburg later. And we're going to go into Early then falls back. He can't get back now. All right. He has no way back to Lee. So what he attempts to do is he attempts to reinforce the Shenandoah campaign. What this, of course, causes, all right, is Grant to say, I've had enough of this. And he sends Philip Sheridan to deal with the situation of Early and Mosby in the Shenandoah.
Well, yeah, no, and what I'm talking about in the West also is you still have Hill in the West, and he does win a battle or two over there, but it's pretty much over at this point.
Well, it's the end game because the pressure is now being applied to the major forces of the Confederacy that never lets up. It never lets up. Now, let's go back to the mass charge that Grant orders again at Cold Harbor.
Yeah, I think we kind of glossed over Cold Harbor a little too quickly as well, because that was a very bloody battle, and I think it deserves a little bit more than 10 minutes. So
now, Grant is when he orders the charge again. I think Grant is pushed by two things, right? One is wishful thinking. Okay. The other thing is he's angry. He's angry and frustrated that his troops, all right, and his commanders are not moving as quickly as he wants them to. Okay. But he's also in the mindset of, okay, my troops have been marching through this thing. Lee's troops have been marching through this thing. Both sides look exhausted. I'm going to try and do an overwhelming charge. And what is in his mind, I think, in his wishful thinking mind, is he's hoping that the Southerners their morale has basically collapsed. That this push will they're not ready for this push again, okay, and that their morale is such that I can shove them out of the way. Okay, it was absolutely wishful thinking on his part, and after that situation, he is in tears. He is beside himself with it. Meade has a more philosophical approach to it. He's like, well, I mean, you're not going to. This is what happens in battles when people die. It sounds callous, and in a certain way it is, but the situation is what it is. Okay, was it a mistake? Yeah, it was a mistake. And on the Southern side, when he orders that second charge, the Southerners look at that and they go, Grant is just a butcher. He's just trying to send his wave of his men into certain death, and those men do it, right? At which point Lee actually admonishes his crew, stating, look, I mean, up to this point, he's handled his forces pretty well. I mean, we're on the defensive here. We're not able to take the initiative, and at no point can we go on the attack and have any chance of success.
Right? Now, why is that? If you have the high ground, especially around Cold Harbor, because we will get into the because I don't know, these battles are mostly stalemates, so we can go for both sides and discuss how Grant could have maybe sacked Richmond half a year early.
That's why can't Lee do it? Because if Lee moves and leaves an opening, Richmond's done, and Lee doesn't have the forces not to do that.
You use your big guns, rain fire upon them, and you charge.
And you're going to charge into their defenses. Good plan. Worked for Pickett. Try again.
But this time you have the high ground. You're going to be able to you're going to clear a lot of them out.
What you have basically, the thing to remember about this stuff is you have the high ground on that side. Where do you think the enemy is set up? Basically, what you have people doing when you go in the attack is you got both sides have a high ground. So you got to go into a valley and then back up again. All right. This is
they did dig trenches and defenses. Obviously, okay. Grant's not it.
And exactly. so okay. You want to go do exactly what now? You can say what you want about Pickett's charge. Lee doesn't repeat that mistake either, does he? Okay. So I mean, and that's what you're basically calling for. You're calling for the destruction of the Army of Northern Virginia for what purpose? The one thing is
sitting there,
even if
sitting there and trying to run doesn't work for him either.
Even if you have a 1-to-1, it does. It does. This is what you don't understand. Bleeding the army like this slowly is, in one sense, the only hope that they have, because they're hoping for a political solution.
But you're not going to get a political solution out of this.
That's 2020. That's hindsight. That's 2020 hindsight, dude. No, they don't.
So you're hoping at this point, that you can kill so many Union men that the Union is finally going to be like, forget that we're a stone's throw away from Richmond. We want peace. No, it's not going to work that way.
Well, it looked like that was going to happen, especially with what happens later on in next week when we talk about Atlanta.
Yeah, no, and we need to talk about the actual presidential elections up in the North, because the Confederacy had what, 1 6-year term for their president, so they didn't have a cycle during the war at all. They never came, you know, Jefferson Davis was never had to run for re-election.
Jefferson Davis didn't, no, but I do believe that they had congressional elections. All right. Now, what's interesting about this next election, all right, in 1864, if you want to talk about it now, is the fact that a Confederate state is now going to participate, because it's no longer considered a Confederate state, and that is Tennessee.
Yeah, because they did hold parts of Louisiana, but there was other areas that were still in Confederate hands, and there's still battles going on.
Almost all of Tennessee is, for all intents and purposes, all right, under the control of the North. All right, yeah, the South makes incursions back and forth, but in reality, the North has pretty much all control over it. All right, and there, of course, there are some really heavy Union counties in Tennessee, and one of the Lincoln's running mate this time, all right, is Andrew Johnson. All right, who is
a Southerner. He obviously wasn't a Confederate, but
he was a senator from Tennessee. All right, so
and that has major repercussions when it comes to Reconstruction, at least the initial few years.
What happened? It has because of the death of Lincoln, but I mean you got to remember, Reconstruction was in a lot of ways was revenge for Lincoln's assassination.
And it was a second Civil War. I do want to go into Reconstruction, have a series on that after we wrap up the Civil War series, which I don't know. What do you think? Another 3 episodes and we're pretty much done, right?
Well, it depends on how fast you want to move through it, but yeah, 3 episodes you can do it.
But okay, so you are Grant. It's Cold Harbor. You try your second wave. That doesn't break through. As you explained, he was beside himself.
Yep. That night he wept. He went to his tent weeping. He's inconsolable. They let him sleep that night. In the morning, he gets up and goes, "Let's move south."
Do you think a third try could have broke the Confederate lines? I don't think there was any breaking the Confederate lines at that point.
No. Right when he did it and he saw the result, he understood. Okay, the idea of, it's not that the idea of charging these mass positions was going to be devastating or killing people. He understood that. Everybody did. He also at that point, though, he understood Lee's army is not ready to crack.
Here's a question that just popped in my head. Why do you think there's such a difference between the American Civil War and World War I, where you had people like Grant and Lee who learned their lesson, but in World War I, they never learned their lesson, did they?
Well, okay, now they did, but okay, what people don't realize, and if you want, we can talk about World War I. But one of the problems with World War I was how the technology needed to be used. Okay, they constantly were trying to explore how to utilize the new technology, and they didn't crack it until the end. Okay, that's the difference in World War I. Okay, people talk about over the top and all the crap that went on with that and the lack of results. Okay, you got to remember both sides were constantly trying new things to break the stalemate. Okay, people tend to gloss over this. All right, World War I leads to a lot of different innovations, some of which are horrifying. Okay, but there's attempts to do things. All right, there's also an idea. All right, I mean, you start off with planes, and what are planes used for? All right, in World War I. All right.
Reconnaissance at the beginning of the war, and then they start mounting guns on them. But
then they start mounting guns on them, and they start shooting at one another. All right. That's great. What didn't they put in the planes that they could have?
Bombs.
No, they eventually get to the point where they're putting bombs in there. That's true. I mean, but what else could they put in that plane that they never do?
I don't know. I'm drawing a blank. Go ahead, because I don't. The World War One isn't my best.
I'll give you. It's real simple. They didn't put in a radio.
Ah, okay. Because I
Right.
was thinking radio or like radar, but they didn't have radar yet, right? That's a
No.
World War.
Radar's a British invention that comes later. The reason for this is you could have used, on the spot reporting of what was going on if you had put radios in these planes. No one even thought to do this. Okay, and in fact, it's even after the war. All right, people are looking at the radio mainly as a way for the planes to be able to tell each other where they're at. They're being used to let people coordinate the planes, but they're not looking at it from being able to coordinate it with ground. Okay, this could have been quite effective. This could have changed the dynamic completely. Okay, so and the same thing applies. Believe it or not, the same thing applies. All right, in the naval battles, especially Jutland. Okay, they're still signaling to one another, not with radio. They're still signaling to one another with flags, both sides. All right. Now, okay, this all sounds well and good, but you have the ability to have radios. Why the hell aren't you freaking trying to direct your things with radio? Now, of course, part of the problem with radio is as soon as radios had been created, people learned to DF them. People learned to direction find. Okay, and I mean, it's fairly simple to direction find, or if you've got certain things. So you could pinpoint where people were. So they were always worried about, if I use the radio, the enemy will know where you are. Well, that's all well and good, but when you're fighting the battle, the enemy already knows. Okay, I mean, at that point in time, now it's time to move tactically. All right, once the enemy knows where you're at, trying to keep radio silence is kind of stupid.
Well, what's interesting though is they didn't have radios in the planes in World War One, but they had the telegraph in the hot air balloon in the Civil War. I mean, what?
Well,
you would think they would have thought about the radio.
Well, yeah, it would have been something that could have changed the dynamic, especially if you had married that with having their reporting married to the artillery and used them as part of the artillery spotting mechanisms. All right, it really could have changed the dynamic to let the generals know. One of the big problems of World War One was the fact that the generals, when they ordered the attack to take place, go over the top, that's all they could do at that point right there. They had no control over how the battle went. Absolutely none. All right. They didn't know where their troops were. This is the other thing. You could have sit up there and made freaking radios with batteries, right? And had them running with radios to be able to try and provide you, okay, with some kind of intel as to what's going on and where your troops are. Once again, this combined arms effective, all right, they never truly achieve it because they don't realize the advantage radio could give you in the tactical sense. Okay. So what were they doing? How did both sides in World War One do things? Well, okay, so once the line stabilized and you're back basically into trench warfare, they started trying things that, well, let's try this. So what's the first thing they tried? Well, the first thing they tried was, let's bring up even more artillery, pound their freaking trench lines as to hell and back, right? And then send the troops across. Okay. And they did that. And the troops would go in there and they would take those trenches and everything else, which were, a few hundred yards away, like 500 or 600 yards, 700 yards away. And they would be in those trenches and the enemy would counterattack with their artillery. Okay. And take the trench right back. Okay. So like, okay, well, what can you do? Well, we'll bring in bigger guns to have a farther reach, okay, and we'll pound a bigger section of it, okay. That they did the same thing. The same result would happen because all they did is started doing, trench works in depth. Whereas you'd have a trench line, 1 or 2 trenches. Now you've got trenches built on trenches behind that, so that as the troops come in, your troops can fall back to these other trenches. where they can do it. And when these guys are in the trenches, they just get hit with the artillery because you already know where they are. They used to be yours, right? And then you can go back there and take them back again. Okay, so what was the next thing that they tried? Okay, well, we've learned now that whenever there's a mass artillery barrage, all right, that's when the enemy comes. So we'll pull back. We'll only put a few forces in these forward trenches. When the artillery starts, we'll pull everybody back. We'll wait till the artillery stops, and then we'll run our troops forward and then slaughter the guys as they come up. Okay, so that isn't going to work. So what's the next thing we do? Well, let's try the rolling barrage. But rolling barrages are dangerous. What do I mean by a rolling barrage? You start an attack, all right? Your infantry starts to go, and they're trying to basically move behind this rolling barrage of artillery, right?
Yeah, which I had brought up a couple of times during other episodes we've done of the Civil War talk about why couldn't Lee have tried that. But yeah.
Okay.
So I do know what a rolling barrage is. Yeah.
Okay. So that sounds all well and good, but then the problem becomes when your guys get to that forward line, your artillery is at its max range now. Okay, their artillery is at close range and max range, so they can pound all their artillery on top of you, and you get wasted again. So these were things that they were attempting to do. Now, what else did they attempt to do? People forget this. It was early on that the Germans tried to frickin' use their chlorine attacks. All right, gas warfare begins. Okay, all right. So now, what's interesting about the gas warfare is the fact that there were people were worried about this prior to World War I. People don't know this. People were worried about using poison gas. All right, and they had peace. They'd had conventions. All right, that banned the use of chemical weapons. But what they had really done is they'd only banned the use of chemical weapons in artillery shells. Okay, so the Germans said, "Aha! You only ban them on artillery shells. We'll just use these tanks, and we'll just open these spigots and create this chlorine cloud." Okay. So they were the first ones to, of course, use it. Now. Toward the end of the war, nobody gave a shit, and they were using artillery shells loaded with poison gas. But I mean, this is the kind of things that were going on. People,
and gas warfare itself is rather stupid, in my opinion, because like you said, the first time the Germans used it, didn't the wind change?
No, first time the British tried to use it, the wind changed.
Okay, all right. So, but yeah,
the Germans understood initially what it was. The thing about the chlorine attack is when it's actually easy to defeat the chlorine. People don't realize this. It's actually easy to defeat a chlorine attack. You just pee on a cloth or pee on a towel or something, and you can then because of the uric acid, all right, it basically makes an effective block against the chlorine.
Yeah, but then they go to white phosphorus they use now, but that's more of a like almost like napalm, right? It burns you or whatever. But
well, white phosphorus it's not a chemical attack. It's not meant to it's basically a burning attack, explosive type of thing, but it's creating a burning. It's like napalm in a certain regard. All right, but it's little bits of phosphorus that burn when you're trying to get through an area. You're trying to absorb the oxygen into that area. It's very good for wiping out tunnel complexes, simply because it basically absorbs all the oxygen in the tunnel.
That's why Israel keeps getting accused of using it all the time, because they're attacking the tunnels from Palestine. I got it. Okay, that makes sense.
What they're doing now in Vietnam, the Vietnamese learned very quickly that that kind of sucked. So what they started doing was they were actually created their tunnels to have an area that was actually had in order for you to get into the complex, you actually had to dive through a portion of it through water, all right, that was filled with water. All right, there were areas where they had air holes coming up, but those air holes into the center of their complex, their tunnel complexes, were hard to find. It was always easier to find the actual entrance of a tunnel rather than those holes. When they did find those holes like that, though, they just opened them up and drop in white phosphorus right down there, and it would basically wipe out anybody in that tunnel.
Yeah, no, and All right, so yeah, we've gone over an hour, so we usually do about an hour for the Civil War episodes. So just to wrap it up, you don't think Grant could have busted through it all? There's no way he could have taken Richmond about half a year to a year early?
No. Could he have, if he had other forces? Possibly. It would have been extraordinarily difficult. The defenses, the two most heavily defended cities, all right, on the North American continent at this point are Washington, D.C. and Richmond. Okay. So taking Richmond was never going to be an easy prospect no matter what. And the interior lines that Lee has, unless Lee makes a mistake, there was no, I mean, he was not going to be able to basically outwit Lee. Okay. Unless he made a mistake. The closest he came led to the Petersburg siege. And the fact that it led to a siege at Petersburg was Lee got trapped there simply because he got there first. He got because of the lackadaisical attitude of some of Grant's commanders. If Grant's commanders would have moved faster, they'd have already taken Petersburg, and at that point, they would have been forced to leave Richmond. If Grant could have taken Petersburg right then and there, the battle would already been over. All right. So the reality is at that point, it was going to settle into a siege. Okay. There's another possibility that people talk about. I'm not sure how effective and how accurate it could have been. Would have been say, okay, let's pivot again and cut the rail lines and try and straddle across both rail lines. I'm not too sure how feasible that would have been, though, for Grant to do. You got to remember, Grant is not like he's not dealing with the same situation that Sherman is later on in the war. He's dealing with the fact that he has to maintain his supply lines. All right. Unlike Sherman. Okay. You got to remember, Grant is in the East with the Army of the Potomac, and they need to keep communication open. Okay. With Washington. Washington will not allow him, all right, to be incommunicado. They'll let him do and make his decisions, and Lincoln is more than willing to let Grant run the battle and run the war, right? But he's not willing to be out of touch with Grant. So he's got to keep the supply lines. He's got to keep these things open, and he does. So he doesn't have the freedom of movement. The other thing, of course, is while Grant starts off with all these numbers of people, he has to leave troops in certain areas, all right, to keep those lines of communications open, all right. So as he's moving, the size of his command is shrinking, all right, at a faster rate, actually. All right, than Lee's is. The problem is that he started with a hell of a lot more troops, and he can handle this attrition. Furthermore, as the siege begins, the greatest advantage that Grant has in this kind of an environment is he's going to be getting more and more troops. He knows that reinforcements will be sent, that they are training more troops, and more troops are coming, right? And he's got plenty of logistics. Lee doesn't.
Yeah, on the flip side, Lee gets trapped in a siege. It pretty much becomes like Vicksburg. But they are able to break out, and when they do, they leave Richmond on fire, and they surrender. Or what? 2 weeks later at Appomattox Courthouse.
Well, they go.
If he had retreated now, instead of getting into the siege situation and took the president and the cabinet with him, wouldn't that have been smarter? Other than that,
no,
there's no way
for
Lee to lift the siege,
once again, I said this before. Where's he going to go? Where's he going to go?
I mean, what other option do you have? Do you just sit there, hunker down, and hope
remember what the strategy is? The strategy is to wait for the election to happen, hoping that there will be a new president. So,
Well,
so you can say that wouldn't it have been better than once the election turned in Lincoln's favor and he was reelected? Well, couldn't they pulled out that much earlier? Okay, that sounds all well and good, but what time of year was that? What time of year elections held?
yeah, no, in the winter. Yeah.
Okay, moving in the winter sucks. Okay, troops don't march well in snow, in the cold. It just doesn't work well. That's how you lose troops. That's how troops die.
Um. Okay, you have Sherman in the West, pushing. Do you just let Atlanta fall and try and relieve Lee? Because now, like I said, you're stuck in a
Okay,
Vicksburg
now what?
situation. Already did
Let, wait. Okay, so you run to it. You run those troops down. Okay, great. So you marry the army of the Northern Virginia. All right, with the southern people under Hood. Okay, um, assuming that the Bragg has already been relieved. All right, Richmond is gone. The North, everything's basically north of North Carolina is now from North Carolina on is Union territory. Okay, and Sherman is now married up with Meade and Grant. And those are the forces Lee's replacing. Yeah, he now has the extra forces from Bragg, but Bragg was already pretty massively outnumbered by Sherman. Okay, and now you're not only outnumbered by Sherman, you're outnumbered by Sherman and Grant together, and your forces were already outnumbered by Grant. Look at the force correlation again. And furthermore, at that point in time, what are you going to? Where are you going to go? Atlanta is the only place you're really going to try and head for, right? Except for the fact that before the election, of course, before the election, Atlanta falls.
No, you're pretty much in a losing battle at this point in the war. Obviously, we all know how this ends. If you do marry the two armies together, and you break Lee out of Richmond, and you send Grant reeling before Sherman gets
how are you going to send Grant reeling?
You're going to hope that you can. You're going to hope that you can push him out, and you head towards DC. And you take the initiative.
That's the same kind of wishful thinking now. All right, that Grant had when he tried to take Cold Harbor.
I know. It's
it's the same kind of wishful thinking. All right, that Lee had when he set up there in order to pick a charge. I mean, that there was no way that was going to happen. He didn't have the forces for that. If you would have married up Grant, or if you would have married up with Bragg / Hood, all right, the power of those forces would not nearly even come close to Sherman, Grant, and Meade. I mean, it would have been okay. You guys are just surrounded that much faster. The correlation of forces now has just become that more adverse.
Yeah,
it really has.
I think at this point it's pretty much the writing is on the wall.
Well, it isn't though. You got to remember from the way they're doing the strategy at this point. Yeah, the writing's on the wall because we know what happened, but the election hasn't happened yet. There's a lot of fracturing going on in the North as far as there's a lot of people. It's an unpopular war, all right, with many people. There's a lot of people are saying we should just let them go, and people are doing their own kind of internal polling saying, well, Grant's going to, or Lincoln's going to lose the election. All right. It's very possible Lincoln thinks he's going to probably lose the election. And there's many people who believe that he would have lost the election if it wasn't for the fact that Sherman, all right, takes Atlanta. Now, if they would have pulled out earlier before the election and Grant has taken Richmond, the same effect prior to Atlanta falling, the same effect would have happened. It would have been a great success. Lincoln would have again been reelected. Okay, so you're dealing with hindsight, and when you're looking at these things about what could he have done? All right, how could these forces have married up? You could have tried this. Okay, you could have said ordered basically the forces in the South, all right, to abandon Georgia completely, all right, and then go up north, all right, to join Lee all right, to try and relieve the siege that way. The problem with doing that was you had to be able to move like that, and Sherman could easily interdict you at any point in time. Freedom of movement, while the North, while the South could use rails, all right, and it could move around. Guess what? So could the North. You want to know why? Because they had the entire ocean ways on their side. They can load troops onto ships and drop them off wherever the hell they want. This is why Mobile has already been taken out of the war. Mobile was a great shipyard, all right? It was taken out of the war fairly quickly by the Union forces and pretty much held for the duration, right? Simply because the Union forces said, okay, we don't need any Southern ships sailing from here. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm thinking if you're free next week, we either do the election in 64 or we go ahead and talk about Atlanta. But we're at the wind down.
We need to talk about the capture of Atlanta first because of its effect on the election. The tremendous
absolutely. Yeah, it sounds good to me. Thank you very much, MC, as always. Thank you guys for watching. I'll be back tomorrow with the Red Eye stream. So either that or I might do another I Drink and I Know things stream. I don't know. Depends on if I drink too much beer tonight. I might just not have any beer tomorrow. It is St. Patty's Day. You gotta give the liver a break sometime. All right. Good night, everybody, and good luck. We're out of here.